Hi everyone, good afternoon. Let's go through the reaction and the steps of glycogen synthesis. So last video we covered regulation as well as the steps in glycogen breakdown. So this time we'll be making glycogen. So a good place to start is when you're trying to go from scratch, and then we could build from there because there's some different components that you need to set first. All right, so in making a new chain of glycogen, you would need some UDP glucose. Okay, so UDP glucose, as well as our existing chain, would in general be converted to a longer glycogen molecule, and that would be n greater than 5. Alright, so we have to make these two components first, so let's go through how we approach that. Okay, so first, to make our UDP glucose, we would have to take our glucose 6-phosphate and transform it to glucose 1-phosphate. We're going to be using that same phosphoglucomutase. It's able to go back and forth. So this time we need glucose 1-phosphate instead of glucose 6. Alright, so once we have that step completed, next we would take our glucose 1-phosphate, and we're going to also add a UTP, uracil triphosphate. And these together, both of these reagents together, will become pyrophosphate, as well as our sugar nucleotide, UDP glucose. This is the key player right here, UDP glucose. That's what we actually need. So this reaction is going to be catalyzed by our UDP glucose pyrophosphorylase. So UDP glucose pyrophosphorylase. We do have a third step here where we're going to take our pyrophosphate and we're going to break it down into just phosphate, inorganic phosphate. The enzyme here is pyrophosphatase. However, we do already have our UDP glucose, so we don't really have to worry about that. Okay, now with our UDP glucose, we go and we could start making this new chain of glycogen as our template. So when we're making our new chain, we would take our UDP glucose, so that I should actually change to a different color. This is all part of the same process though, but just like a different subsection of it. So number 1, we're going to take our UDP glucose, and we're also going to then create a linkage. We're going to make our first alpha 1 to 4 linkage. We have this enzyme called glycogenin that's going to serve as the template for this process when we're making this new chain once we have our UDP glucose. So glycogenin has this tyrosine on it. That's the amino acid of importance on this enzyme. And its ability, it's described as glucosyl transferase. So this tyrosine is basically going to attack one of the OHs on our UDP glucose, and it's going to make this first linkage. Next, we're going to still be using glycogenin, but instead of the tyrosine doing attack, between the two molecules, we're going to have the terminal fourth carbon, and its OH is going to actually attack the new glucose molecules, or UDP glucose molecule C1. And this process, again, it's going to happen with the glycogenin as the template, but this is going to be repeated for 6 times, because we want a total of 8 glucose in the glycogen in this process. Alright, so we have our new chain, and then we go up here. We could also make the branches, so let's make the branches in the glycogen chain that we just formed. Okay, so we're going to have 7 away from the non-reducing end in order to have this process. So if I draw a glycogen core, so we already made a glycogen core here. Let's draw that glycogen core that we made previously. Okay, so here's our core, and we're going to take the 7 away from the non-reducing end of our glycogen core, and we're going to take it and transfer them on top of this glucose here to make that branch. We're going to be using a branching enzyme for this process. And again, we're going to take the 7 away, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and we're just going to transfer them over to this spot right here to make that branch. We're going to make a new alpha 1,6 branch in our glycogen. Alright, once we have that, so we have our branched glycogen now, and we also have our UDP glucose. So now the final step is just to go UDP glucose plus our non-reducing end of an existing glycogen and this non-reducing end of an existing glycogen molecule, the length of it has to be at least n is greater than 4. Alright, now this is kind of like the conclusion of everything here in this process of glycogenesis. Our last enzyme is Glycogen Synthase. And when we use that enzyme, we get a new thing of glycogen. And now it's n greater than 5. So we need both the UDP glucose, and we also need the non-reducing end of an existing glycogen in order to use glycogen synthase and get to a glycogen molecule that now has n greater than 5 units. Alright, we also have some regulation of this step. So I mentioned again PP1, that phosphoprotein phosphatase 1, this is going to actually come into play here. So we were talking about how PP1, that's the name of the enzyme, PP1 will remove phosphoryl groups from phosphorylase A, and it'll convert it to phosphorylase B. So that was in glycogenolysis, or breaking down glycogen. It moves the phosphoryl groups off from A, and it goes to the inactive form B. So A becomes B phosphorylase. However, this protein is also important in our glycogen synthesis. We have something called the insulin signaling pathway, and we also have this phosphorylation of glycogen synthase at play too. Okay, so let me get this all straight before I go into here in depth. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to be, again, using glucose to an allosteric site on phosphorylase A. That's going to then allow for insulin. Insulin is going to be shown when there's high blood glucose, and then that's also going to draw PP1, and phosphorylase B will be the result of that. Okay, so now let's move into glycogen synthesis. We're going to be changing that. So insulin, again, insulin signaling pathway. We're going to be increasing glucose important to the muscle and simulating the activity of hexokinase. But let's get down to the big nitty-gritty of it. So again, we have two versions of glycogen synthase. We have glycogen synthase A and glycogen synthase B. And I'm just going to copy this over. Why not? Alright, so A is still the active form of this enzyme. However, B has phosphorylation. B is actually the one that is phosphorylated. We also have this glycogen synthase kinase, or GSK3, in play too. GSK3 will phosphorylate glycogen synthase A. When glycogen synth A is phosphorylated, it becomes inactive. Alright, so insulin, this is an insulin signaling pathway. So when we have insulin, glucose 6-phosphate, and glucose, PP1, it's going to go and take off those. Let's draw this first. Okay, so when we have insulin, glucose 6-phosphate, and glucose, that's going to cause PP1 to remove those phosphate groups on glycogen synthase A. When it does that, this is active. However, when we have this GSK3, this is going to phosphorylate it. So then it's going to go to glycogen synthase B, and it's going to inhibit this process. Sorry that's a little bit out there, and it sounds like it's all like convoluted. It kind of is. So yeah, I think that's all there is to it. Thanks so much for tuning in, and have a good one.